Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Jack Rasmus to Wider View. Jack is a PhD in political economy and teaches economics at St. Mary's College in California. And Jack is the author of a number of books, including Central Bankers at the End of Their Ropes, Monetary Policy and the Coming Depression, Systemic Fragility in the Global Economy, Obama's Economy, Recovery for the Few, and his latest book, The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Bush. Jack is also the host of a weekly radio show called Alternative Visions on the Progressive Radio Network. And welcome to Wider View, Dr. Jack Rasmus.
Well, glad to be here. Just a minor correction. The neoliberalism book is about policy from Reagan to Trump.
Okay. Well, I did see it somewhere as Reagan to Bush, but I'm glad you worked Trump in there. Good.
Well, it's really the major part of the book. Over 100 pages is just on Trump policy.
Okay. Well, we'll want to get back to that for sure. I invited you primarily to talk a little bit about China because, we're seeing so much coming from the government, from the media right now, demonizing China, accusing the Chinese government of deliberately causing the coronavirus outbreak. And 4 years ago in his campaign, Trump said that China was raping our country and manipulating its currency to make its exports more competitive. So what is the real situation with China now, and how did we get here?
Well, first of all, you can't really trust too much of what Trump says. That's the first thing, and he flip-flops. As you indicated during the election, he was bashing China, and then of course it was he's the best friends of China now because he needs the trade. However, there is working through the administration this certain lineup of forces that are trying to blame China for the situation, which is very typical of this administration. They blame everybody else for its failures and take credit for anything anyone else has accomplished. So, that's par for the course. It's politics in this particular administration. But one thing that people should understand is that 49% of the exports from China to the U.S. come from U.S. companies in China, affiliated with other companies. But these are American companies that are exporting back to the United States. So are they Chinese or are they American? Is the problem China or the problem U.S. multinational corporations that have moved offshore under neoliberalism for the past 4 decades in search of cheaper costs of production, but also to get in on under the umbrella of those economies that are expanding, particularly in Asia. And of course, the U.S. has given these companies all kind of tax incentives to move offshore. And free trade is all about this process of offshoring because you reduce the cost of U.S. multinational corporations sending their same products back to the U.S. Without tariffs. So it's really part of the same system. And then there's what we call the twin deficits arrangement of late U.S. imperialism, where the U.S., since neoliberalism in the late 70s and ever since, has constructed this arrangement whereby it allows these other countries to run a trade surplus with us. In other words, we run a trade deficit with just about everybody in the world. It's not just China. On purpose, we run the trade deficit. We allow them to sell more, and U.S. multinational corporations among them, to sell more into the U.S. than we buy, than we sell to them. And part of the arrangement of the twin deficits is that then the understanding is as they accumulate U.S. dollars because of the surplus on their end, they will recycle those U.S. dollars back to the United States to buy treasury bonds and other private investments. And that major inflow of dollars back to the United States allows the United States to run a massive budget deficit. You see, it's the trade deficit that finances the budget deficit. And why do we have the budget deficit? Because we have these $15 trillion in tax cuts since George W. Bush, and trillions of dollars more in war spending, which causes these huge budget deficits. But the money, dollars flowing back from the trade deficit fills the gap. You see, so it's all an arrangement by U.S. capitalism and multinational corporations to allow them, for the first time ever in U.S. history, to massively cut taxes and increase war spending for 20 years now. But they couldn't do it without the trade deficit, and they couldn't do it without the agreement of allowing these other countries around the world to sell more to us than we sell to them. Okay. So, this is part of 21st century capitalism and part of the globalization. Globalization means that the U.S. companies have been able to, in the last 20 and especially 40 years, penetrate all these economies around the world, including China's, and increase their profits significantly in the process.
These jobs that we've always accused China, or the Republicans always accused China of stealing our jobs. I don't think they came over here and took them. I mean, that was our policy, right?
Yes, U.S. multinational corporations dragged those jobs with them as they went offshore. You see, It's not as if the Chinese stole them. And of course, to some extent, when U.S. corporations go offshore, they have to agree to share the technology and so forth. And then you have other national companies of these separate countries who develop and so forth. I mean, a good example is what's going on with all this personal protection equipment, PPE. Mm-hmm. Right. we used to produce that in the United States, but we offshored all that. We let the American companies go offshore with that. And 3M and all the others that make the masks, that's why we're having to buy the stuff from China, because that's where the U.S. companies went. So we have these shortages because it's profitable for these companies to go offshore, as they say it, take their supply chains offshore. But then we have the problems we've got now when we need certain products and they don't exist. It's kind of as if we were in a war with a country, a real hot war, and we decided before we declared war to move our military production into that country, right. and then to say, okay, we're losing the war because we don't have control over making airplanes. We sent them to Japan in 1940,
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it works. It's particularly bad when the nation to whom we have exported all those jobs and it makes all of our stuff is now a nation that we've decided to demonize and that we want to control.
Well, the demonization will only be during the election year. You'll see after that the demonization will go away.
Oh yeah.
Because U.S. companies aren't going to come back from China. No way. No. These companies that went over there and took the jobs over there, they're it's much more profitable. Not only because of the lower cost for products they export back, but they're in under the umbrella there to sell into these massive consumer markets over there, and that's where they want to stay. Right. So there's no way that capitalist policies, which the government follows now unlike ever before in this country, is going to change that.
I think you're right about that. I mean, we can't really keep going on that score. Maybe we can keep demonizing Russia, but I don't think China is a good candidate. We talked about the coronavirus situation, the situation with the ventilators and the masks and all the other PPE. But we also have another problem looming on the horizon right now, which is the oil price. We now have 26,000 people out of work and no real prospects of how we're going to restart the economy, no plan certainly to restart the economy. And now we have oil prices at record lows. The entire U.S. fracking industry is, I don't know, what would you say, running on the fumes or bankrupt. How do you see this oil crisis working out for us?
Well, the oil crisis, there's a history to this. And partly it's because the global economy is slowing down dramatically. And it was, by the way, before this virus thing. Oil prices were slowly declining. And the global economy, global trade and production was declining. Global GDP, the volume of global trade, flat before all this happened. And this virus effect just is a precipitating, accelerating the whole decline process. And you can see it mostly or very clearly in global oil. The demand is really, I mean, demand is down, 30 to 40 million barrels a day, 30 to 40 million barrels. You see this futile attempt by the Saudis and Russia to cut supply to try to prevent the oil prices, which are now well below $20 a barrel. And for there, even the future prices drop negative.
Yeah.
So it's really collapsed because there's two reasons. One, there's a collapse of demand, and there's a problem that they can't cut their supply equivalent to the collapse of demand. They talk about these deals to cut 10 million barrels a day, Russia and the Saudis. Well, demand is 30, 40 million barrels a day. It's futile. Now, why is there such an excess supply of oil amidst this now double whammy of collapsing demand? Well, excess supply is really because of American fracking companies. OPEC used to control the price and supply of oil, but once, 5-6 years ago, the U.S. began deregulating environmental controls and everything, and started this fracking revolution, right? Both gas and mostly oil. Fracking's mostly about oil, not gas. The U.S. produces in February, it was producing 13 million barrels a day. The Saudis barely 10, and the Russians maybe 11. So the big problem is the U.S. frackers upsetting the whole global supply situation. Now, why are the frackers keep producing more and more? Well, because they have to, you see. They have to because most of them have expanded production by borrowing and issuing what's called junk bonds. In other words, high-risk bonds that come due here in this year and next, and they have to service those bonds, roll them over. They have to pay the principal and the interest on those bonds, so they have to generate more volume of output and revenue in order to pay the banks for the, and the investors. Kind of like Argentina, So in order to do that, they got to pump more, and the lower the price goes, the more they pump. Because they have no alternative. And to some extent, Russia's in the same boat. Russia's heavily dependent on oil sales to finance its government budget. So Russia can't agree to really cut supply, or it's really going to exacerbate its budget, and it's not going to be able to continue its domestic spending. And that's true with, Nigeria, Angola, Venezuela, all the other OPEC countries are all oil-dependent economies, so they got to keep pumping, and the lower the price, the more they pump, and that drives the price even lower. So what the Saudis are doing, they're trying to drive the price so low to drive the frackers into bankruptcy in the U.S. See, the fight isn't the Saudis and the Russians. The fight is really the Saudis and the American frackers. Why don't the big oil companies in the U.S., why aren't they opposed to this? Because they're waiting for these smaller frackers to go out of business, then they'll gobble them up at cheap prices, you see. So they're, sort of sitting on the sideline watching the Saudis do their thing. This guy over in Saudi Arabia, bin Salman, he really rolls the dice. And what he did was flood the market with more supply instead of cutting the supply. Well, why is that? Because he really wants to drive the price down, to drive the U.S. frackers out of business. And many of them are in the process of defaulting right now. And we're going to have a lot of junk bond defaults in the oil patch. A junk bond market's about $4 trillion market. Over $1 trillion is just in the patch, the oil patch. And when they start defaulting, what you're going to see is defaults spread to other junk bond areas, like retail, big box, Neiman Marcus, Lord and Taylor, they're already, JCPenney's, they're going. All of those are hotel chains, they're going to go. So we're going to have a lot of defaults in the U.S. in corporations in these areas, including at the lead is going to be the energy companies, the frackers. And that's why the Fed is pumping trillions of dollars into the banks now to be able to absorb these defaults.
Where is that money coming from? This is the other thing. I mean, this is what I hear people talking about all the time is like, well, if the Fed has 2 trillion or 4 trillion or whatever the number happens to be to throw at the banks so that the market, the Dow Jones average doesn't go too low, why can't they pay off student debt, or why can't they give us free health care or anything else that the people want? They keep telling us there's no money, but then when the banks need money, they just seem to print it.
Well, see, the way the Fed is made up, its mission is just to bail out the banks, you see, and nobody else. They bailed out commercial banks until 2008, and then they had to start bailing out what's called shadow banks. These are banks that aren't part of the Federal Reserve System, but they're as big as the commercial banks. I'm talking about private equity firms, hedge funds, investment banks, all of those, pension funds. This is what we call shadow banks. They're unregulated, basically, and they take high risk, and they are always causing these financial bubbles that then bust. In 2008, the Fed had to take advantage of a loophole in its mandate and say, okay, we're going to bail them out too. And the Fed bailed them out to the tune of $4.5 trillion. You see, Congress doesn't bail out the banks. It's the Federal Reserve that bails out the banks, and folks don't know how that works and why they're getting all the bailout. Now what the Fed is doing is not only bailing out banks and shadow banks, it's bailing out the whole capitalist business system. They're bailing out all kind of non-banks, large, medium, and small. This is unprecedented historical adventure, experiment, whatever you want to call it. Already the Fed's committed to $9 trillion, twice of what it did, $9 trillion in 6 weeks compared to 18 months, $4.5 trillion. The Fed is the garbage can for all the capitalist debt now. In other words, give us all your debt, Fed, and the Fed gives them money. And that's what the bailout is about. In fact, it's bailing them out even before the banks fail. In 2008, they were failing, and then it bailed them out. But here is a preemptive bailout of the big banks, and not just the banks, but the whole capitalist system. Now, non-financial corporations, by the way, that had record profits in the last 2 years, that are so flush with cash, they don't need the money, that their valuations are through the roof anyway, that they can go to markets and issue bonds. They've drew down all their credit from all loan credit lines. They're floating in cash, and yet they're being bailed out. So it's a real I don't know what to call it. The pigs are at the trough.
Well, and to me, it seems like, first of all, there's such a lot of moral hazard here, because obviously if if I'm a bank and I speculate and lose a lot of money and knowing the Fed will bail me out, and they bail me out, I'm not going to stop doing what I was doing. They'll have to bail me out again and again. And is there no limit to this, or does at some point the dollar cease being worth anything, or what happens?
Well, the bailout, as I said, was $4.5 trillion in 2008 and 9. And the Fed purposely kept interest rates near zero, 0.1% for 6 years under Obama. Free money, in other words. Come get your free money, bankers, from the Fed. And what did the bankers and businesses do with this borrowed money from the Fed? Well, what they did was they loaded up on debt again. $10 trillion in corporate debt under Obama and the first years of Trump here. And now they got to pay for that debt. And now their income is collapsing. And how are they going to pay for it without going bankrupt and defaulting? Well, the Fed's filling their black hole with all the free money. You see, it's not taxpayer money. The Fed does not bail out with taxpayer money. The Fed simply creates the money, an electronic entry in the Fed's books on its balance sheet, that says, okay, here it is, bankers, and here it is, corporations. We put it on our server. Come and get it. It's free money. But the capitalist system has set up central banks for that purposes. The central bank, the Fed, was created in 1913. Why? Because there was a major financial crash in 1907, 1908, and there was a big stink about the Congress bailing out the banks that caused the crisis. So they got together, the bankers and the politicians, and they created this institution called the Federal Reserve. In fact, they didn't even call it a central bank or because it sounded bad. They sold it by calling it a Federal Reserve. We like federalism in the U.S., right? So they created, but the primary function of the Federal Reserve is to bail out the banks so that Congress doesn't have to, and the politicians don't take the heat with the taxpayers. You see,
right.
Most people don't know how it occurs and how it's managed, but basically it's creating money. And simply giving it to the banks, and the banks, give it to their big corporations and buddies first, and the rest stand in line. Even small business stands in line.
Seems to me there's got to be a consequence to this in some place, somewhere down the line. I know that, some people that I read are predicting another depression, not a recession like 08, 09, but something that's perhaps on the scale of the 1930s, between what's happening with these companies being bailed out, all the speculative investment and the leveraging of all these loans that probably can't be repaid because the economy is not working and so forth. But this time we don't have an FDR. And we've got a Congress that is, it seems to be pretty useless, except when Wall Street tells it to do something, in which case it's really efficient. We could be looking at something much more difficult than what we've faced in a very long time. Or would you agree with that? Or do you think that there's a way out of this?
Well, in my 2010 book, Epic Recession, Prelude to Global Depression, which was an analysis of that crisis, what I did was distinguish and define and explain the difference between a normal recession, a Great Recession, which I call epic, and a bona fide Great Depression. What were the differences between those other than just the depth, the quantity of the decline? What are the qualitative differences between those? And basically, to make a story short, what I argued was a normal recession is not associated with a financial crash. A Great Recession, epic recession, is associated with a financial crash that is then stopped and stabilized. A Great Depression is when you have a financial crash that is not stopped and leads to a sequence of further financial crashes. If you look at the 1930s, we have the stock market crash in 29. We have a contraction of the real economy after that, which is severe, but it's not a depression yet in 29-30. You see, it's what we would call a Great Recession. But what happens at the end of 1930 is we have a first banking crash, which is just regional in the Midwest. Then in 31, we have a bigger banking crash. 32, a bigger one. 33, another one. And each time we have a banking crash, what happens is the economy ratchets down to a deeper level. So what happens in the Great Depression is you have this cascading effect on the financial side that keeps dragging the real economy deeper and deeper. As banks go under, other companies, non-bank companies go under, layoffs grow greater and greater. And, that's the history of the Great Depression. Now, where are we now with this one? Well, where are we now with this one is we have the potential for a financial crash that's building. But unlike in 2008-9, when we had the financial crash first that dragged down the rest of the economy, then the Fed threw in $4.5 trillion to stop a second crash of the financial system, and the thing kind of stabilized at a very low level of growth for years, never really came back except for banks and some other sectors of the economy, certainly not for the working class, right?
Mm-hmm.
It took us
Right.
6 years to get jobs back to where they were in 2007, right? But this time around, we got this reverse situation where the real economy is contracting first, right? And the risk is the financial side, as defaults multiply, whether they're in energy, fracking, and retail or whatever, multiply and bring down the banking system. That's why the Fed is throwing massive amounts of money to prevent the financial crash. Whether it succeeds in that remains to be seen. We don't know yet, and I'm not convinced that that will prevent a financial crisis here within the next 12 months. If it does, then we are deeply on the track of a 1930s-like crash and situation.
We had some social democrats, with a small d, in government at that point, and some outright socialists in government back in the 30s. And now, it's neoliberalism that is on the forefront, and the government plan for the people is basically austerity. We're seeing now Mitch McConnell saying that, too bad about those state pension funds, let the states go bankrupt. We've got people talking about suspending the Social Security payroll taxes, which is going to obviously...
Wait a minute. Right? Let me correct you on that. They've already suspended the company's contribution to the payroll tax.
Oh, boy.
They've already done that. And hidden behind this CARES Act is a half a dozen major tax cuts for businesses that you're not hearing about,
Right.
Including, I won't go through it, but basically, it's called net operating loss changes in the tax code. There's all kind of big tax cuts for businesses here. And that means all the businesses, not those that are just in trouble. They've already undermined the Social Security halfway. What they're talking about is undermining it totally by suspending the payroll tax for workers, right? Well, that door was opened by Obama. Obama was one of the first to really suspend the payroll tax, and that opened Pandora's box, right? We often see Democrats open up the Pandora's box that the Republicans, when they get in office, use as an excuse to drive it all the way through. And of course, that happened in 1997-98 with Clinton's tax cuts. And when it got to George W. Bush, he just blew that door wide open and gave $3.5 trillion in tax cuts that Clinton was already dabbling and proposing. And, free trade under George W. Bush and opening of China, to free trade, essentially, with PNTR, that was in deregulating the banks and shadow banks. That was Bill Clinton,
Right.
That was Bill Clinton. So, the Republicans and the Democrats, under neoliberalism, you got corporate Democrats running the Democrat Party. And that's why you don't see the kinds of solutions that you used to see in the 1930s. And that's why you're not going to see them again with Joe Biden if he gets elected, which I don't think he will. And you're certainly not going to see it with Donald Trump here, who is a total free enterprise, is going to save us from everything at all times.
Yeah, we should probably talk about Trump a little bit more, because I think Trump made a lot of promises. I mean, I think Trump really, his base is the working class. And he certainly made a lot of promises to them. I mean, that's his voting base, not his finance base. But he's made a lot of promises. I'm not going to touch Social Security or Medicare, and we're going to reopen the coal mines and all the other nonsense. I'm going to have great trade deals and bring the jobs back and all this kind of stuff that I think anybody who knew anything about the economic situation knew that was not going to be the case. But what is the policy that's being done in the economic sphere from Trump right now, and who's running it?
Well, you got to remember, American politicians during election year say what they think people want to hear. They have no intention to do it. Then they turn around and they do what their advisors and their lobbyists tell them, right? That's especially true with Trump. Trump is the prince of liars here, right? Mm-hmm. Right. But it's just a matter of degree, because they all play that game in both parties. But Trump is an extreme example of that. Had no intention of. His base is not the working class, right? Although he gets a number of working class voters, particularly in the red states, who are misled by the right-wing blogosphere and Fox News and whatever. Local politicians, Republicans controlling and the religious right controlling the agenda and the talk subjects, the message, right? But his backers are big business and a lot of small business, particularly in the Midwest, in the red states. He doesn't care about the blue states, the Northeast and the West Coast.
Clearly.
And that's why you hear Mitch McConnell, who's his echo, and Trump pretty much saying, we're not going to bail out the states, because the states that are most affected by the virus and are most in trouble are the blue states. So let them sink, and we'll point the finger at them and we'll blame them for their crisis that we helped create by not bailing them out. Mm-hmm. That's the strategy, very, very clearly. Mm-hmm. Well, as far as Trump policy is concerned, as I said in my book, Scourge of Neoliberalism, 100 pages just on the evolution of Trump policy. What is the essence of Trump policy? Well, basically, it's an attempt to restore neoliberalism that ran into a wall with the 2008-9 crash, right? Mm-hmm. But to restore it in a more aggressive, virulent form. There are 4 elements to neoliberal policy, and 4 are in Trump's policy. One is fiscal policy. What is this fiscal policy? Well, it's increasing war defense spending by hundreds of billions a year. At the same time, massive tax cuts of trillions of dollars. The 2008 Trump tax cut was not $1.5 trillion. It was $4.5 trillion, because they don't count the tax cuts for U.S. multinational companies doing foreign business. That's not included. And they assume that part of the tax cuts will be offset by economic growth of 3 to 4% a year for 10 years. Well, that's gone, right?
Right.
They don't say that the middle class is going to start in 2024 paying increased taxes big time. They don't count all that in, and they come with this phony $1.5 trillion, but really it's $4.5 trillion. And then in 2019, they added another $427 billion in loopholes for businesses on top of all that. And now, as I said, in the CARES Act, there's even more. I haven't calculated how much, but there's even more tax cuts. So it's tax cuts for business. That creates these huge deficits, offset to some extent by the twin deficit thing I talked about, the money coming back to some extent. Mm-hmm. And that's what Trump's trade war was about, to ensure that money and more money keeps coming back to the United States from offshore. So this trade policy works in concert with his tax policy. And the monetary policy is keep interest rates super low, because if interest rates are super low, then U.S. multinational companies doing business abroad can make profits in the local currencies, and they can buy more dollars when they repatriate that money back to the U.S. If the interest rates were high, the dollar would be high, and multinational corporations would be able to exchange their Argentinian pesos from their business in Argentina for fewer dollars and fewer dollar profits. So keep the dollar low by keeping interest rates low. And that's why he had a fight with the Federal Reserve, because the Federal Reserve for a couple of years was trying to raise interest rates anticipating a recession like this. No, he wanted them to keep it low, and he whacked them on the head. He whacked Powell the chair and Fed on the head, forced him to lower rates. At the same time, he was subsidizing corporations with this massive tax cuts. In 2018, Fortune 500 companies, for example, increased their profits 27%. 22% of that was due just to the tax cuts. So big subsidization going on through the tax system of corporations. And then corporations turn around, and with these fat profits, what do? They give it back to their shareholders in form of stock buybacks and dividends. Under Trump, $3.4 trillion were given back in stock buybacks and dividends. 3.4 trillion. And with the tax cuts, they get to keep even more of that than ever before. But, even under Obama before that, it was $5 to $6 trillion in buybacks and dividend payouts. It's just that Trump accelerated the whole process with his massive tax cuts. And that enables them to, funnel the money back to their shareholders. And then you got industries like the tech industries, where most of the people owning the shareholders are the senior managers of the tech companies. Right. So really, like 70% of the buybacks go to senior management in the tech companies, the Googles and the Facebooks. So they're just giving money back to themselves massively. That's the whole thrust of fiscal monetary policy. You see, economists used to believe that it was about, you manipulate monetary policy and fiscal policy, taxes and interest rates in order to stabilize the economy, to prevent inflation, prevent recessions. That's nonsense. In the 21st century, capitalist policy, fiscal monetary policy, is about subsidizing as never before capitalists and big corporations. It's a big funnel, two big funnels. Sending money to shareholders and the wealthy 1%. And that's why we got so much income inequality. It's not that wages are alone being kept down. It's on the financial side. We're funneling, unimaginable wealth into the hands of the few. Now, that's how fiscal monetary policy works. The trade policy, I said, is this twin deficit arrangement with free trade and recycling the dollars, coming back, keeping the dollar low. Industrial policy is all about austerity, what you talk about. Let's cut social spending and programs and Social Security and keep wages down. Let's destroy unions. Let's privatize pensions. Let's privatize the healthcare system. In other words, put the burden on the workers to pay for their healthcare. Give them phony 401k plans instead of real defined benefit pensions. Right? Destroy the unions. Don't raise minimum wages. That's industrial policy. So you got a combination of industrial policy, trade policy, fiscal policy, monetary policy, all working in concert with each other, all designed to retransfer income and wealth from the rest of us to the corporations and to the wealthy 1%, to their institutions, to their banks. That's the way 21st century capitalism works. And boy, is it working for them.
It certainly isn't working for the rest of us, that's for sure. And it doesn't look like we're going to be given any opportunities to change that, at least not through the system that's owned by that 1%.
Let me just add a point, and
sure.
That is, in my book, I talk about the material bases for neoliberalism. Which emerged in the 1970s and the crisis then. But I also mentioned about how it hit a wall here under Obama in 2008-9, and Trump's trying to resurrect it in a new virulent form. But I also have chapters that point out that he won't succeed. And that's because capitalism itself is changing, restructuring faster than ever before. And this set of policies that exist as we know it today, neoliberalism, no longer is sufficient for capitalism in the 2020s and 2030s. Something new is going to come out of this. We don't know what it is yet. But I also have a chapter indicating that the political system, as we knew it, is an obstacle, and they're changing the political system as we speak, destroying what exists of democracy in this country, because democracy is an obstacle to the evolution of the policies they need to keep enriching themselves. So those who are interested in the political side, I have chapters addressing that. And also, it's a long-run historical analysis here, not based upon ideas simply that, it's about privatization, austerity, and so forth. No, you got to look at what's really driving the evolution of capitalism in the 21st century to understand the policies, to understand the attack on the political system and democracy. And I try to do that in the book.
Well, good. I will certainly have a link to your book in the show notes for this program, and I certainly recommend to the listeners that they go and pick up a copy of The Scourge of Neoliberalism, U.S. Economic Policy from Reagan to Trump.
Also, if they want my day-to-day, week-to-week analysis of the current crisis, my blog is a good place, jackrasmus.com. Mm-hmm. Or even if they're on Twitter, several times a day I comment on what's happening on a daily basis on my Twitter account, which is @Dr. Jack Rasmus. So the more recent stuff they can follow my blog and my Twitter feed for.
Great. I'll put all those in there too. All right. Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate this.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Well, great. Thanks again.